Marcus Sullivan pressed his back against the cold concrete pillar, ice forming on his gray beard as the December wind howled through the underpass. At 72, his body had finally surrendered to the streets. 3 days without food, longer without sleep that didn't come haunted by the screams of Vietnamese children. "Where were you then?" he rasped into the darkness, his words directed at a God he'd stopped believing in 40 years ago. "Where were you when I watched that village burn?" The veteran's hands trembled, not from cold alone, but from withdrawal. The last bottle had shattered 2 nights ago during another nightmare. Now, there was nothing left to dull the memories, nothing to quiet the voices of the dead that followed him from Saigon to this godforsaken bridge in Ohio. Marcus closed his eyes and saw their faces again. Little Mai, maybe 8 years old, reaching for her mother. The explosion. The silence that followed. "Some hero," he whispered bitterly. "Couldn't save them. Can't even save myself." The temperature dropped another degree. Somewhere above, Christmas lights twinkled in warm houses where families gathered around tables laden with food. Down here, death crept closer with each labor breath. The memories crashed over Marcus like mortars in the night. He'd been Sergeant Marcus Sullivan once, decorated Marine with a Bronze Star and a future. Back when his shoulders were straight and his faith unshakable, when he believed God watched over American soldiers fighting for freedom. That was before the Tet Offensive, before the village of Enlock, where everything went wrong. His unit had been protecting civilians during evacuation when the attack came. Marcus still remembered the weight of little Mai in his arms as he carried her toward the helicopter. Still felt the heat of the explosion that tore her from his grasp. Still heard her mother's wail, piercing through the smoke and chaos. "God helps those who help themselves," his chaplain had said later in the field hospital. Sometimes his plan is bigger than we can understand. Marcus had stopped believing that day. What kind of God let children burn while their protectors watched helplessly? 43 years later, the anger hadn't dimmed. It had fermented into something poisonous that ate through marriages, jobs, and hope. The bottle had been his only companion for decades, numbing the guilt that gnawed at his soul. Now even that was gone. Just him and the cold and the voices of the dead, growing louder as hypothermia clouded his thoughts. The soup kitchen at Sacred Heart Catholic Church had tried reaching Marcus for months. Sister Elena, a tiny woman with calloused hands and infinite patience, would find him huddled behind dumpsters and offer warm meals with gentle Spanish accented English. "Señor Marcus, por favor." Just soup, nothing more. But Marcus always turned away. The sight of the church's towering spires made his chest tight with rage. Every cross reminded him of the chaplain's empty words. Every hymn echoing from the sanctuary mocked his unanswered prayers from decades past. "Keep your charity," he'd growl, clutching his bottle tighter. "God abandoned me in that jungle. I don't need his leftovers." The congregation, mostly immigrants from El Salvador and Mexico, would watch sadly as the grizzled veterans stumbled past their outreach efforts. They'd seen broken men before, but something about Marcus's fury seemed different, deeper, more personal. Father Rodriguez had tried approaching him once during a particularly cold November night. "My son, you don't have to carry this burden alone." "Don't call me your son," Marcus had spat. "Your God watched children burn and did nothing. He can keep his love." The priest's eyes had filled with compassion, but Marcus was already walking away, disappearing into the darkness where faith couldn't follow him. The whiskey had burned through Marcus's last $20, but it wasn't enough to silence the voices. On this bitter Sunday morning, he stumbled towards Sacred Heart Church, fury boiling in his chest as organ music drifted through the doors. The morning mass was in full swing when Marcus burst through the sanctuary doors, reeking of alcohol and desperation. The congregation of immigrant families turned in shock as he weaved down the center aisle, his wild eyes fixed on the altar. "You want to know where your God was?" he shouted, his voice cracking with decades of pain. "He was watching children burn while I begged him to save them." Mothers pulled their children closer. Father Rodriguez stepped forward with outstretched hands, But Marcus's attention had locked onto something else entirely. The beautiful statue of the Virgin Mary, her serene face gazing down with infinite compassion. "And you," Marcus snarled, pointing an unsteady finger at the carved figure. "Mother of God? What kind of mother lets babies die screaming for their mothers?" His words echoed through the silent sanctuary like blasphemy given voice. Even the children stopped crying, sensing the terrible weight of his anguish. Where was your mercy in Vietnam? Where was your love when I watched them burn? The statue's gentle expression remained unchanged, but something in her painted eyes seemed to follow him as he swayed on his feet. Word of Marcus's outburst spread through the small Ohio town like wildfire. By Monday morning, every shelter, soup kitchen, and charity organization had his description. The Sacred Heart incident had crossed a line that even the most compassionate couldn't overlook. "I'm sorry," Marcus said Janet at the Salvation Army shelter, her voice heavy with regret. "We can't have someone who disrupts religious services. There are families here with children." The homeless shelter downtown gave him the same response. Even the secular food pantry turned him away after hearing about his drunken blasphemy. In a town where faith ran deep, Marcus had made himself untouchable. Sister Elena found him digging through garbage behind the grocery store that Tuesday, his movements weak and unsteady. She approached carefully, her heart breaking at the sight of his deteriorating condition. "Senor Marcus, please, let us help. Help!" He laughed bitterly, not looking up from the rotting produce. "Your people made sure I'm poisoned now. Good Christian charity, right?" That was not charity. That was fear. But God's love killed those children. Marcus roared, his voice echoing off the brick walls. "And now it's killing me." Perfect. Winter was coming early this year. The weatherman predicted the worst December storm in decades, and Marcus Sullivan had nowhere left to run. The storm hit Thursday night with a vengeance that meteorologists hadn't predicted. Snow fell in sheets, driven sideways by winds that howled like the ghosts of Unlock. Under the concrete bridge, Marcus huddled in his thin jacket, his body shaking uncontrollably as hypothermia set in. His lips had turned blue hours ago. His fingers, black with frostbite, could no longer feel the cardboard beneath him. Each breath came shorter than the last, white puffs of vapor growing fainter as his body began shutting down. "This is it," he whispered to the darkness, his voice barely audible above the wind. "This is how it ends." The hallucinations started slowly. Shadows moving in the swirling snow became Vietnamese villagers. The wind's howl transformed into children crying for help. Marcus saw Mai's face again, her small hand reaching toward him before the explosion tore her away. "I'm sorry," he sobbed, tears freezing on his cheeks. "I'm so sorry I couldn't save you." His heart stuttered, skipped a beat, then another. The cold was merciful now, numbing the pain that had followed him for decades. As consciousness slipped away, Marcus Sullivan prepared to meet the children he'd failed to protect. Death had come to collect him under this forgotten bridge, and he was ready to surrender. In the space between heartbeats, between life and death, the howling wind suddenly stilled. A warmth that defied the blizzard enveloped Marcus, and through his frozen eyelids, he saw a light piercing the darkness under the bridge. She stood before him in robes of deepest blue, her face radiant with a love that made his war-hardened heart tremble. Not the carved statue from the church, but a living presence whose eyes held all the compassion of mothers throughout time. "Marcus, my son." Her voice was softer than morning rain, carrying an accent that seemed to blend every language of sorrow he'd ever heard. "You have carried this pain so long. I failed them," he whispered, his breath no longer visible in air that had become impossibly warm. "All those children, I was supposed to protect them. You carried their memory with honor," she said, kneeling beside him on the frozen concrete. "But guilt was never meant to be your cross alone." Her hand touched his forehead, and Marcus felt decades of rage melting away like ice in spring sunshine. For the first time since Vietnam, he could see Mai's face without the explosion, could remember her laughter instead of her scream. Why now? He asked through tears that were no longer frozen. Why didn't you come sooner? I was always there, Mijo. You just weren't ready to see me. When Marcus opened his eyes, dawn light filtered through the bridge's concrete arches. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by pristine snow. But the greater miracle lay closer at hand. His fingers, black with frostbite hours before, moved freely without pain. The blue tinge had vanished from his lips, replaced by healthy color he hadn't seen in years. His heart beat strong and steady, no longer the erratic rhythm of a dying man. Beside him lay a thick wool blanket that hadn't been there before, still warm as if recently placed. Underneath sat a thermos of hot soup, steam rising from its contents, and a paper bag containing fresh bread and fruit. Marcus sat up slowly, testing limbs that should have been frozen solid. The concrete beneath him was dry in a perfect circle, as if the storm had never touched this spot. Beyond that circle, snow lay 3 feet deep. This can't be real, he whispered, but his stomach growled at the smell of the soup. Real or not, his body needed sustenance. As he ate, Marcus noticed something else impossible. The voices that had tormented him for decades were silent, not suppressed by alcohol or drowned by distraction, but genuinely, peacefully quiet. For the first time in 43 years, Sergeant Marcus Sullivan's mind was at rest. The morning sun felt warm on his face as he whispered, "Thank you." Marcus stood outside Sacred Heart Church for 20 minutes before finding courage to climb the steps. The same doors he'd burst through in drunken rage now seemed impossibly tall, but something deeper than shame drove him forward. Father Rodriguez was arranging flowers at the altar when Marcus entered, his footsteps echoing in the empty sanctuary. The priest turned, his weathered face showing surprise but no fear. "I didn't think I'd see you again," Father Rodriguez said quietly, setting down the white roses. "Neither did I." Marcus's voice cracked as he approached the Virgin Mary statue. Her carved face seemed different now, familiar in a way that made his chest tight with emotion. "Father, I need to tell you something impossible." The priest waited patiently as Marcus struggled for words that could capture the inexplicable. "She came to me last night, under the bridge. I was dying, and she saved me." Marcus reached out tentatively, his fingers barely touching the statue's blue robes. "I know how it sounds. I know you have every right to throw me out after what I did here. Tell me what happened," Father Rodriguez said simply, gesturing toward a front pew. As Marcus recounted his encounter, describing details he couldn't have imagined, the priest's eyes widened. When Marcus finished, Father Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. "Marcus," he said finally, "miracles often come to those who need them most." News of Marcus's transformation spread through Sacred Heart's congregation like ripples in still water. Sister Elena was the first to approach him after Sunday Mass, her eyes bright with tears of joy. "Señor Marcus, you look different, peaceful." Within days, the same community that had turned away from him in fear began reaching out with cautious hope. Maria Santos, whose children had cowered during his outburst, brought him home-cooked tamales. Roberto Martinez, who worked construction, offered Marcus day labor to help him get back on his feet. "Why?" Marcus asked Father Rodriguez as another family invited him for dinner. "After what I did, why are they helping me?" "Because they recognize grace when they see it," the priest replied. "Your healing gives them hope for their own struggles." The local VA office, contacted by church members, arranged emergency housing and medical care. Dr. Patricia Chun, examining Marcus at the clinic, shook her head in amazement at his test results. "Your blood work shows no sign of the alcohol poisoning I'd expect from chronic addiction. Your circulation is perfect despite documented frostbite exposure. Medically speaking, you're healthier than men half your age." But the greatest miracle was quieter. Marcus slept through the night without nightmares. The children's voices that had haunted him for decades remained blissfully silent, replaced by an inexplicable sense of peace that seemed to radiate from deep within his healing soul. 3 weeks after his miraculous encounter, Marcus found himself back under the bridge, but this time he wasn't alone. Tommy Rodriguez, a young Iraq veteran with hollow eyes and shaking hands, huddled in the same spot where Marcus had nearly died. "I know what you're carrying," Marcus said gently, settling beside the younger man. "I carried it for 43 years. Tommy looked up suspiciously. "You don't know nothing about what I seen over there. IED took out your convoy? Kids in the crossfire? Friends who didn't make it home?" Marcus's voice held no judgment, only understanding. "I watched children burn in Vietnam. Blame myself. Blame God. Nearly killed me with hate." For the next hour, Marcus shared his story. Not the miraculous parts at first, but the pain, the guilt, the bottles that never numbed enough. Tommy listened, his defensive posture gradually softening. Word spread through the veteran community about the old Marine who understood their darkness. Soon Marcus was visiting the VA hospital, sitting with broken soldiers whose wars spanned decades. He started a support group at Sacred Heart, creating a bridge between the struggling and the spiritual. "How do you do it?" asked Danny Phillips, a Vietnam-era Navy corpsman. "How do you sleep at night?" Marcus smiled, touching the small medallion of the Virgin Mary that Sister Elena had given him. "I learned I wasn't meant to carry it alone." Christmas Eve at Sacred Heart overflowed with faces Marcus now recognized as family. The sanctuary glowed with candlelight as Father Rodriguez invited him to share his testimony. Marcus approached the pulpit where months ago he'd stood in rage, now filled with quiet peace. "I came here broken," he began, his voice steady. 43 years of anger at God for letting children die while I watched helplessly. I cursed this statue, blamed heaven for my hell. His eyes found the Virgin Mary figure, her serene face seeming to smile in the flickering light. But when I was dying under that bridge, she came to me. Not the carved stone, but the living mother who holds all our pain. She taught me that carrying guilt isn't honoring the dead, it's dishonoring their memory. In the front pew, Tommy Rodriguez sat with his wife and daughter, sober for 3 weeks. Danny Phillips nodded through tears beside Sister Elena. The congregation, a tapestry of immigrants and natives, veterans and civilians, had become one family through shared grace. That night changed everything, Marcus concluded, not just for me, but for everyone she leads me to help. As midnight bells rang out across the snow-covered town, Marcus felt complete for the first time since Vietnam. Have you ever witnessed something that science couldn't explain? Share your story in the comments below and let us know if you've experienced moments where the impossible became possible.